You know that feeling you get when you're standing at the foot of a really big mountain? Or maybe just looking at a massive, complex project laid out before you?
Mm.
You see the summit or the finished goal, but the path, that's just, well, it's a jumble of rocks and trees and potential dead ends, and you think, where do I even begin?
Or maybe you're already on the path, you're hiking hard, putting in the work, but you look around and wonder, am I actually moving up?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I just
Oh,
scrambling in place?
exactly. That uncertainty, that feeling of potential overwhelm on a long, difficult journey. Well, today we're doing a deep dive into a framework designed precisely for navigating that kind of challenge.
And it's for a context that is described in our source material as pretty extreme, even humanly impossible.
Right. We're pulling our insights from a document focused on the incredibly demanding task of starting new churches in places where Christianity isn't already known pioneer contexts, as the source calls them.
Yeah, the framework is titled The Pioneer Church Planting Phases, sometimes just called the CP phases. It was first introduced by Scoggins and Rockford back in '94, but it's seen significant updates since then.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack this 7-phase framework. What is it? Yes. But maybe more importantly, how does it actually help teams navigate this complex, often unpredictable process?
Of establishing new faith communities from scratch in these, well, incredibly challenging environments.
Exactly. We'll see how it functions as both a guide for the journey and, crucially, a way to measure progress.
So maybe let's start with the fundamental question. Why? Why is a framework like this even necessary?
Good question.
The source material stresses that these phases are built for pioneer contexts, and it explicitly references that idea from Romans 15.20 contexts where Christ is not already named.
Right, so we're not just talking about areas needing more churches, but places where the gospel is essentially unknown or maybe deeply misunderstood.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And these aren't easy places. The source highlights, so they're often characterized by, ignorance of the gospel, deep-seated misconceptions,
Okay.
significant difficulties for those sharing the message, and sadly, a high potential for hostility and even persecution for new believers.
Wow. That sounds like operating in a constant headwind. It's really no wonder the source uses that strong phrase, humanly impossible.
It truly is a monumental task.
Yeah.
And in particularly resistant environments,
Yeah.
moving forward can take a very, very long time.
Yeah.
So you can imagine a team on the ground facing this huge, kind of nebulous challenge day after day, potentially for years, with seemingly little to show for their effort. It's tough.
And that's where that old principle kicks in, right? You cannot manage what you cannot measure. If you can't see you're moving forward, how do you stay motivated? How do you even know what to focus on next?
Exactly. Without clear markers, goals can blur, vision can fade, and teams can feel like they're just endlessly running in place, working hard but lacking strategic direction. The source actually nails this with a phrase it uses, the curse of the so-that's.
Oh, I think I know what you mean. The curse of the so-that's.
Right.
Like we're doing this so that this other thing can happen, so that eventually, maybe way down the line.
Right. And you find yourself several steps removed from the ultimate goal.
Yeah, you get bogged down.
You can get distracted by good, worthy activities that are maybe related to the work, but aren't the core task of planting a church that can reproduce. These phases are designed to help teams recognize and avoid that drift, keep the main thing the main thing.
Okay, so how does it function then? The source calls it a combination of two tools.
Yeah, it's described as a combination of two tools in one. First, it's a measure like a yardstick. It has 7 distinct phases, each with a clear definition of what needs to be accomplished,
Okay.
and a specific crest point marking the transition out of that phase and into the next one. That's the measurement part.
Got it. And the second part?
Second, it's a guidebook. It includes suggested activities for each phase, offering ideas on how to move forward.
But importantly, not a rigid set of instructions, right?
Crucially, no. The source is clear. It's not a cookbook or some kind of magic bullet. It offers structure and suggestions, but it recognizes that the unpredictable nature of the field requires flexibility and, importantly, creativity. Spirit-led creativity, even.
That makes sense. Okay, let's actually walk through these 7 phases then and see how that journey unfolds on the ground. How are they structured as we go through them?
Sure. So for each phase, the document gives it a title, a definition which describes the primary objective, that crest point, which is the observable marker of transition, and then the suggested activities, which are just that, suggestions, descriptive, not prescriptive.
All right, kicking things off, phase I is forming, preparing, and launching the team. Sounds foundational.
It is. This is all the essential groundwork before anyone even sets foot in the Pioneer location. It covers recruiting the right people, strategic planning, crucial support raising,
Oh, logistics?
yeah, and intensive pre-field training, and building healthy team dynamics because team health is absolutely vital under pressure.
Makes total sense. You have to build your launch pad before you can launch. And the crest point for phase one, what signals you're moving on?
Simple and concrete.
Mm.
The first team members arrive on the field. That marks the transition from preparation to presence.
Okay, they're on the ground, boots on the ground. What's the immediate focus?
That moves them into phase two, learning the language and culture. The primary focus now is immersion.
Right.
The source highlights that for most team members, reaching functional fluency in the local language is the major undertaking here. That often takes, 2 to 3 years of dedicated study.
2 to 3 years. Wow.
Yeah, it's a big commitment. And alongside this, they're building relationships, observing cultural norms, trying to understand the worldview, and naturally sharing Christ as opportunities arise through building that trust.
So the crest point isn't becoming like a linguistic PhD, but reaching a practical level of skill.
Exactly. The crest point is when most of the team reaches their appropriate level of functional fluency and is able to shift the majority of their time away from formal language study and toward evangelism. They'll keep learning, of course, but the main energy shifts.
Which naturally propels them into phase 3, I assume.
Right. Phase 3 is preaching the gospel to groups and individuals. With language proficiency higher, the team now actively and intentionally focuses on evangelism, clearly communicating the gospel message and seeking to persuade people to follow Christ.
Okay.
This can involve sharing with individuals they've befriended or deliberately seeking out receptive groups or influential people. The source calls them men or women of peace.
Finding those open doors, and how do they know they've successfully crested out of this phase?
The crest point for phase 3 is when a team member begins discipling a believer from the people group who has potential connections within the community.
Ah, okay. So finding that first person who believes and might be able to influence others.
Exactly. It's a crucial moment. But it's really important to remember, though, that evangelism doesn't stop here. It continues as part of the ongoing work in all the later phases.
Right, it's not like you check a box and move on. Okay, so you've got a believer, maybe more than one. What's next?
That leads to phase 3, discipling believers and working toward gathering. The focus is now on nurturing that new believer or believers.
Deepening their understanding.
Yeah, and the source emphasizes that from the very beginning of discipleship, the idea of following Christ together in community is central. You're preparing them mentally and spiritually to eventually gather regularly. This phase is about foundational teaching and preparing them for that communal life.
Makes sense. And the marker for transitioning out of phase 3, when do they know they've established something?
The crest point here is when a fellowship group of 3 or more believers from the people group begins meeting together regularly. It's that visible emergence of a local body, even if it's small to start. Individual discipling definitely continues, that's ongoing, but the corporate gathering is the key marker here for moving to the next stage.
Phase V sounds like things are really starting to take shape then, more established.
They are. Phase V is developing the body of believers. Now the team is actively working with that new fellowship to help it grow, both in numbers and, importantly, in spiritual maturity.
Right.
They focus on helping the group develop a clear identity as believers meeting together, fostering mutual commitment to one another, and crucially, helping them grasp the vision for sharing their faith and eventually multiplying, thinking beyond themselves.
This phase has a particularly detailed crest point criteria in the source, doesn't it? It feels like a real test of the group's health and viability.
It is. It's quite comprehensive. The crest point for Phase V is reaching what the framework calls critical mass. And this isn't just hitting a certain number, it's multifaceted.
Okay, break that down for us. What does critical mass look like?
So there are several components. First, group commitment. They actually identify themselves as a local church, not just a study group or a temporary gathering.
Okay, a sense of identity.
Then size, ideally around 10 or more, regularly involved. Then breadth. It includes some demographic variety, like the source suggests at least 3 married men and 2 mature women involved, which can be really vital for cultural influence and sustainability. Then leadership. At least 2 individuals are emerging as elders in the making. People the group recognizes are showing leadership qualities.
Potential future leaders.
Right. And finally, strength. Members are baptized, They've shown perseverance through challenges or threats. They're actively sharing their faith, and they're beginning to think about and maybe even plan for a reproduction.
Wow. Okay, so meeting all those criteria, commitment size, breadth, leadership potential, and strength signifies reaching critical mass.
Exactly. It's a high bar, but it indicates a healthy, developing community ready for the next step, which is phase 2.
That gives a really clear picture. So once they have that critical mass, where does the emphasis shift?
It shifts to phase 6, empowering and installing leaders and the beginnings of reproduction. The primary focus here is on intentionally developing multiple local leaders, specifically identifying and training those who will become elders.
Moving from potential to actual leadership.
Precisely. And the source points out something important. The church planters, the outsiders, often need to deliberately step back and take a lower profile at this stage.
To let the local leaders lead.
Yeah, to allow the local leadership to step up, function, gain confidence, and really own the ministry. They also begin actively identifying believers with evangelistic gifts who could potentially start new works in other locations.
Oh.
Thinking about multiplication.
So the crest point then is the formal recognition of that local leadership.
Exactly. The crest point is the appointment or installation of 2 or more local elders over the church or network of churches. That's a huge milestone.
I bet.
And additionally, the church itself internalizes and embraces a vision for the Great Commission, actively looking beyond itself to reach others and reproduce.
Which brings us logically to the final phase, phase 7.
Phase 7 is reproduction and movement. By this stage, the church or churches are mature. They're functioning under robust local eldership.
Self-sustaining, ideally.
That's the goal. The work of the original church planters shifts significantly here. Their labor is now directed towards catalyzing broader gospel spread through ongoing church reproduction, aiming to see a self-sustaining church planting movement emerge.
So their role changes again.
It does. They might stay involved, but their role is now more focused on mobilizing and perhaps coaching local believers to plant elsewhere, maybe working at a more strategic network level.
And the crest point for phase 7, does this phase ever truly end?
Well, ideally, it doesn't end. This phase is about ongoing multiplication. The crest point isn't really a final destination marker. It's more the activation of a continuous process of reproduction and movement. It keeps going.
Wow, it really lays out a complete picture, doesn't it? From the initial idea of forming the team all the way through to seeing a potential movement take root. The source mentions connections to New Testament patterns too, I think.
It does, yeah. It points to examples like Paul appointing elders in Crete in Titus chapter 1, setting things in order.
Yeah.
And how Paul's missionary journeys themselves, though maybe rapid by our standards, often followed a pattern of establishing churches and raising up local leaders.
Right.
Even if the apostles didn't have quite the same language learning hurdles we often face today, the pattern of establishing local leadership is there.
Okay, that gives us a great overview of the phases themselves. Now, let's maybe dig into some of the nuances and clarify some common questions people might have about using a framework like this. First off, it looks very linear on paper, phase 1 to 7th. Is it always strictly sequential in practice?
Yeah, that's probably one of the most important nuances the source addresses. It's broadly sequential, yes, because, you generally can't develop a body of believers, phase V, if you haven't shared the gospel and disciple believers in phases 3 and 4. That makes sense.
Sure.
However, ministry activities definitely overlap. Language learning continues long after phase 2 is officially crested. Evangelism is vital throughout. Discipleship is ongoing. It's not neat little boxes.
I like the source's analogy. It compares it to a master chef versus someone learning to cook. The chef might blend steps or work on multiple dishes at once, while the beginner benefits from following a recipe more step by step.
That's a great way to put it. An experienced team might operate in a more multi-phase way, juggling different activities simultaneously, whereas a newer team might really benefit from focusing on the clear sequence step by step.
So how do they define the team's official phase then?
The team's official phase is defined by the highest crest point they've fully achieved as a team. But work from earlier phases is still very much happening concurrently.
Okay, so could you hypothetically skip a phase in terms of time, like jump ahead?
The source says you could potentially see the timeline jump ahead. For instance, maybe you share the gospel and an entire family or group believes relatively quickly. Looks like you skipped ahead.
Right.
But, and this is crucial, you can't skip the activities associated with the earlier phases. You still have to do the work of language learning, even if it's ongoing. You still must engage in consistent evangelism and foundational discipleship, even if the timeline seems compressed. Those are non-negotiable parts of the process.
Got it. The work still has to be done. And what about the reality that these are difficult places?
Hmm.
Does the framework account for setbacks, things going wrong?
Absolutely. The source is very clear that setbacks are common, almost expected in some contexts. It's not unusual for a work to temporarily move backward in phases.
Can you give an example?
Sure.
Mm.
Think about a group that reaches phase V, maybe even crests into phase V with emerging leaders, but then faces severe persecution. Members might scatter, leaders could be imprisoned or forced to flee.
And suddenly, you're not focused on installing elders anymore.
Exactly. You might have to go back to focusing on just finding scattered believers, rediscipling individuals who've been traumatized, maybe trying to form small, hidden groups again, essentially operating back in phase V territory, or even phase 3 if you need to find new contacts.
So the framework provides language for that reality.
Yes, and it helps teams understand what their focus needs to be now in the current situation to try and rebuild or adapt. It's a map for the messy, unpredictable journey, not just the ideal straight path.
Does the framework dictate a specific church model? Like, does it assume only house churches?
No, the source explicitly states it's model neutral. While fellowships in these kinds of pioneer contexts often start small and decentralized, maybe meeting in homes out of necessity or for security,
Right.
the phases themselves are designed to apply whether the long-term goal is a network of house churches, cell churches within a larger structure, or even eventually larger central gatherings where that's possible and culturally appropriate. The updated version, notably, puts a stronger emphasis on actively pursuing groups earlier in the process, not just individuals.
Interesting. And how does this fit with the bigger picture of aiming for a church planting movement? Does a phased approach sometimes feel too slow or, I don't know, bureaucratic for that kind of dynamic multiplication?
That's another really important point the source addresses. It argues that a thoughtful and flexible application of the phases can actually help catalyze movements,
How so?
precisely because it keeps the ultimate goal of reproduction in view from the beginning. It encourages teams to be thinking about developing local leaders and fostering a vision for multiplication much earlier than phase 6 or 7. It's baked in.
Yeah, I was struck by that powerful example that the source gives those Vietnamese physicians who, even before they fully understood and believed the gospel themselves, were gripped by the idea of bringing a movement to their people. That kind of thinking.
Exactly. It shows that the vision for multiplication isn't something you just tack on at the end. It should be woven into the entire process, particularly through leadership development, and embedding that Great Commission vision in the local believers early on. The phases help structure that thinking.
So just to be super clear, when we talk about a team being in, say, phase V, is that the highest phase they've reached overall, or is it describing where a specific church plant is?
Good clarification. The source says it can refer to both, depending on context.
Mhm.
The team's overall phase is generally the highest phase that their collective work has attained across all their efforts.
Okay.
But you can also absolutely describe an individual fellowship or church plant as being in a particular phase based on its own development and whether it's met the crest point criteria for that phase.
So a large team might be working in multiple locations.
Right. They might be facilitating work where some groups are still in phase 4, discipleship. Others have reached phase V, critical mass, and maybe one initial work has achieved local eldership and is actively reproducing, which would put the team overall in phase 7 because that's the highest point reached.
Got it. Using this framework also seems like it provides a vital shared vocabulary, doesn't it, for communication between teams, agencies, supporters?
Oh, it's absolutely critical for that. It gives everyone involved, teams on the ground, the agencies supporting them, maybe prayer partners or financial supporters back home, a common language,
Right.
a shared way to describe progress, challenges, and needs. Instead of just a vague update like, things are tough, but we're making connections. Saying, we were solidly in phase V, but due to recent persecutions, we're temporarily focused on phase V activities to regather scattered believers.
Yeah.
Communicates a complex situation very clearly and concisely.
It brings to mind that often told story, whether it's true or not. It makes the point about the U.S. Navy ship demanding that a light dead ahead change course immediately.
Right, and the reply comes back, you changed course. I'm a lighthouse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Without a shared understanding of what you're encountering, what the terms mean, communication just breaks down entirely. The phases offer that shared understanding, that common map, for this incredibly complex task.
Precisely. And that shared language, combined with those clear markers and crest points, helps everyone involved maintain focus on the core mission-planting, reproducing churches and avoid getting lost in those distracting so thoughts It provides that much-needed clarity on the path up the mountain.
So recapping then, we've taken a deep dive today into the pioneer church planting phases, this framework developed by Scoggins and Rockford. We've seen how it provides a crucial roadmap and really a compass for navigating the incredibly demanding long-term journey of starting faith communities where Christ hasn't been known.
Yeah, it breaks down what can feel like a monumental, often overwhelming task into more understandable stages. It offers clear crest points to measure tangible progress, even in really complex and sometimes hostile environments. And it provides that vital common language for teams and supporters, helping ensure that effort stays focused on the core objective.
And, while this framework was built for a very specific high-stakes context, church planting in pioneer fields, the underlying principles are actually incredibly valuable for anyone tackling a complex long-term goal, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
It really shows the power of breaking down the mission into clear, measurable stages, having identifiable markers of progress, and fostering a shared understanding of what success looks like at each step.
Right. All while acknowledging the messy, unpredictable reality of the journey. It's that blend.
It's a potent combination of structure and adaptability.
Well put.
And thinking about that blend, the source material itself reminds us that even with a tool as structured as the CP phases, this kind of work, church planting, is ultimately more art than science. It's deeply reliant on the creativity and guidance of the Spirit.
Essential.
So here's maybe a final thought to carry with you. How can we embrace that blend the value of structure and measurement combined with the essential need for inspired creativity and adaptability in the face of the unpredictable as we approach other complex, mission-driven tasks in our own lives? Something to reflect on, perhaps, as you navigate your own mountains.